In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Okay, welcome to the first Ethics 30 or Philosophy 308 Ethics lecture. So this is lecture 1 before we get into the reading of the Euthyphro. I want to do a brief introduction here to what's going on in this dialogue, but who Plato is, who Socrates is, what's a dialogue, right, that kind of stuff. If you've read Plato before, this will be a little bit of a refresher. I intend for this to be only like a 15 or 20 minute presentation. So it should be a short refresher. If you haven't read this before, that's okay too. So here we go. I'm going to switch over and share my screen with you guys, and we'll just have some running notes to go along with us. And yeah, that's going to be how we proceed. So, all right. So a little bit about Socrates and Plato to get us started, right? Socrates was the first, well, we might say moral philosopher. He was born in 470 BC. He, of course, lived in Greece. By moral philosophy, we mean here the first one to ask really how we should live. In the 500s BC was when we first see philosophy sort of taking shape, when you have the atomists and you have others who are arguing about, well, what is the world made up of, right? Maybe a little bit earlier, 600s BC. But from that, you then had a discussion, well, okay, now that we have a theory about what the world is made up of, it's made of atoms, or it's made of flux and everything changes, or nothing's constant, or everything's constant, and there's no point in anything, right? It comes pretty quickly thereafter that, well, there has to be a kind of agency, right? That whatever the world is that we inhabit about it, and whatever kind of theory we can propose, we pretty quickly come to a question of, well, let's not merely describe things, but let's ask, what should they be, right? This is what we call norms or normative sort of claims. We go from descriptive claims, what is this thing, to normative claims, what should I do with this thing? Right? I pick up a hoe. What is this? Should I use it to move dirt? Should I use it to whack my neighbor in the head? Should I use it, what is this thing for? So moral philosophy or ethics becomes one of the three main branches of Greek thought. Metaphysics is about being or substance, and epistemology is about how do we know things. So what is it? How do we know it? And what do I do with it? Right? That's the sort of basic breakdown of Greek thought. Socrates himself never wrote anything. It wasn't uncommon in the ancient world. Ancient Christians, sometimes ancient Greek Christians mostly, compared Socrates and Jesus. They're both wandering around sages or wise people who sort of talk about how one should live or ask questions, right? Jesus sometimes speaks in enigmatic ways, he's not a moral philosopher, certainly in the same way that Socrates is, but he does ask sometimes enigmatic questions like, well, who do you say that I am, right? And so for early Christians, they saw a kind of commonality here. They were both also put to death, so that sort of helped, right? So Socrates himself never wrote anything. He wandered around for many years, sort of bouncing from place to place, asking lots of questions, prying about, well, how do you live? Well, why do you think this is true? Well, if this is true, then why do you do this thing? Possibly the language that, some people have used to describe Socrates as the first troll, right? Here we don't mean the, sort of mythological creature or, common nursery rhyme sort of, or nursery story sort of trope, but a troll like someone on the internet who continues to pester us and ask questions and play stupid, even though we suspect highly that they know what they're talking about. Socrates does do this very clearly. We'll see this more in the Meno than the Euthyphro. He plays dumb. He said, like, well, I don't even have any idea about any of this, but you're the guy who's so wise, so tell me. That can be a little off-putting to people. Some people find that annoying. In some ways, though, it's also refreshing. It's not Socrates just say, here, I'm going to tell you everything I think about X, Y, and Z, right? A lot of philosophers do that. But anyway, Socrates approaches this in a different way. Finally, it was mostly because of this that he was put to death. He was found guilty technically of three things, right? In the Apology, we see this. In the death of Socrates, we see, he disrespected our gods. He introduced new gods, and he corrupted the youth. So sometimes that gets numbered 2 or 3 different things. But that's the general approach. He corrupted the youth by making them question traditional norms and values. Right? Socrates was a bit of a revolutionary. Maybe not a revolutionary in the way that we think or something like this, but the idea in a very traditional society that we're going to ask questions about, well, why should we do the thing that we do? Is it good? People in power never like questions like that, no matter what society you live in. So that's far from saying Socrates was a populist or something like this, but Socrates was someone who said that it wasn't about that truth doesn't come from power, but instead that power ought to come from truth. Okay. So let's get to his most famous student. That would be Plato. Plato, of course, is foundational for understanding Western thought, foundational for understanding ethics too. He's the one that really brings into the foreground categories like virtue, right? Virtue for the ancient Greeks, here I'm going to write in another color just so it makes it a little clear what are the main notes versus what are my sort of reflections. Virtue comes from the Greek word, I'll write it out here, arete, which means excellence. Sometimes that's helpful to remember. A lot of times in a text that we read, something is translated by virtue, and we look at it and you go, well, what virtue do you mean? Or that's not exactly using the term that seems to be too broad of a usage of this term. But if we use the word excellent, sometimes that's more helpful, right? Like if we say something like, the goal of human life is to be virtuous, you might go, well, maybe it also ought to include to be healthy, to be well thought of, to be generous, to be to be healthy, whatever we want to sort of ascribe to it. But if you say the goal of human life is to be excellent, well, everybody goes, more or less, I'm okay with that claim, right? Like, I'm not sure exactly all that's entailed with excellent, and we have to parse through that, but at least that seems to be a more, right, obvious, everybody's going to be on the same page with that. So sometimes we'll use virtue, sometimes we'll use excellence. The author has to make that choice for different reasons, or the translator of these texts into English, but I'll try and pull out, just as a reminder, hey, this also means excellence sometimes, or this word excellence could mean virtue. It's going back and forth a bit. Okay. Plato certainly writes a lot, and he writes very often with Socrates as the main character. That doesn't mean we can exactly say that the person of Socrates equals the viewpoints of the character of Socrates. But we also, it's hard to know how much this is, but we also can't say that the character of Socrates equals Plato's views. It's probably somewhere in between these two poles, right? When you see Socrates and he says something, is that what Socrates the man said, Plato's views are, or somewhere in between the two? Yes, that's the answer. Yes. We don't have any Platonic statements apart from these dialogue forms, apart from writing in character. And so if you're going to say, I want Plato without the character Socrates, well, you're not going to be able to have a Platonism that looks like that. So this is a bit of a enigma, or a bit of a mystery, right? And it's puzzled people for a long time. And some people have done some work to figure more of this out, right? The character of Socrates appears in other people's plays or other people's dialogues at the same time. and they give a different portrayal of who the person Socrates is. That sheds a little bit of light on Plato's version of Socrates, but again, is that an intentional, or is that like a devoted student who sort of always sees their teacher in the great light? You know, who knows? Okay. Aside from this, he founded a school that was called the Academy, and he is the most influential philosopher in the West. He was very clearly this for hundreds of years. In the Middle Ages, Aristotle became very popular, but at that time, Aristotle was in some part read just as a kind of Platonist. It depended on the reading. Aristotle does come to the foreground, but it largely recedes depending on the kind of philosophy you're doing. He's famous for, Socrates, or Plato rather, is famous for his ideas about the forms, about knowledge, about virtue, about excellence, about justice, and he's famous for his way of doing philosophy, right? He writes exclusively, I say, in dialogues. Why? Well, one, you know, his teacher was killed for saying things out loud, and so by having characters, he gets to say things in the voice of Socrates. And you know, a plausible defense is, well, that's not my viewpoint. I just wrote down Socrates' viewpoint. If you want to dig him back up again and, you know, re-poison him, then go for it. But here, I'm just being a good journalist, right? There's a kind of plausible deniability here with Plato. But there are other clear advantages to this. The dialogue style allows us to enter into the conversation. We are characters too. So when the character Socrates turns and says, well, what do you think about this? In a way, we read that and we go, well, what do I think about this? That's helpful. It's not a science textbook where this is the case and this is the case and this is the case, but and philosophy shouldn't quite be read like that, but it should be a kind of, well, I wonder if that is true. That's a good point. I like that, but is it the case, right? And dialogue helps us to sort of see that we kind of, by putting the voice not in the mind of the author, but through these characters, there's a kind of a conditionality to it, or a kind of, well, I think this is probably true, but who knows? It's not really definite in the same way that science is like, or math works, right? So these texts then are less about claiming to have answers in general. Plato does say things. He does have Platonic doctrines, unlike Socrates. He does introduce, like, this is my idea on X, Y, and Z. But for the most part, he instead is focused on asking the right kinds of questions, right? I like to argue that Plato is concerned with doing philosophy, not merely having the right answers. Having the right answers is great. It makes life easy, but part of having the right answers is, in philosophy anyway, is not merely a cognitive understanding right up here what the right answer is, but an understanding that we've really mulled over, that we've thought about, that we go, I think this is true, although I see the problems with it, or I see the implications, I tend to think this is indeed the case after all. That kind of tendency helps us, not to beat each other over the head in philosophy, but it also helps us to be a little bit humble, which philosophers need a good dose of. So there you go. Key ideas before we talk about the Euthyphro, and we introduce that in the next discussion. Euthyphro is a priest of the Olympic gods. We need to understand that. That's very important. In some ways, Euthyphro thus represents the traditional understanding that all Greeks would have. Euthyphro is a character, but he's also a caricature, right? This sort of overemphasized figure. He's not merely going to the courts to have his case tried, but he's going to go have his father tried. His father tried in a case that is at least questionable, right? To sort of spoil the point, his father found somebody who was beating someone to death, a slave, and he tied him up and he threw him in a ditch, and the guy died of exposure. And Euthyphro is saying, my father is just as guilty of killing a guy as the slave was, and I don't care about the rules. Like, wrongdoers must be put to death. And there's no discussion about, well, here's murder versus manslaughter versus a kind of negligent homicide. Surely these are different. None of that sort of takes place. For Euthyphro, he's just a by the book, rigid. I'm going to say this, the law says X, so I'm going to do it because it came from on high, from the gods, and I'm not going to question it, and I'm just going to do it. Like I said, this is a caricature. Euthyphro is a real figure, but the character of Euthyphro is super simplistic. Now, maybe indeed the real person of Euthyphro was super simplistic. I don't know. But I think that's important to understand that Euthyphro here is representing a whole viewpoint. The dialogues that Plato has often are this way. They are with real concrete historical people, but those people are given a voice that often represents a set of ideas or a whole outlook on life. Okay. 2, in this dialogue, Plato clearly is not proposing a solution ultimately, but he provides Euthyphro with a set of alternatives that are really, really bad for Euthyphro. We'll talk about that more, but and so we have to understand that sometimes coming with the in philosophy as a whole, the goal isn't to let me expound everything that's true and let me come up with this great system and this is always right. But sometimes we can just have limited goals, like saying, well, if this is true, then there are really bad repercussions. So I don't know if that's true yet, but I can deduce this thing. Okay, so there we go. That's a little bit there. Finally, the topic of the dialogue is piety. Oh yeah, I have one more thing to say after this. Topic of the dialogue is piety. That might come across to us as a weird term, right? We probably don't use that. We think pious like overly religious or religiously observant or something like this. And fine. But we have to understand that for traditional societies, like even go like far Eastern traditional societies, Japan, China, right? They mean piety here in a different sort of context, but it's like holding on to the old, holding on to the traditions. In the Greco-Roman world, this was about honoring the gods, but it's also about honoring one's family. It's also about honoring the tradition and the culture and everything. So piety is a huge concept, not merely like something one goes and does Sunday mornings, but piety is like to be upright, to be righteous, right? To be right with all people. Okay. It was a hugely important topic or concept, not like what we might think today. Okay, for Euthyphro, the priest, this question of piety is about his culture, but also his own standing, his own self-understanding, his understanding of the culture, his place in the culture as a priest, but also his self, like, who am I, this kind of person? And so we might think that Plato sort of treats this with kid gloves, or the argument with Socrates is a little bit like too slow. But you've got to understand, like, there's a huge shift that has to happen in Euthyphro's mind here. Okay. Finally, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. If you're not used to the dialogue format, one big tip that I have is try to break it down into parts. What is happening in this dialogue is Plato, through the person of Socrates, is trying to get Euthyphro to define what piety is. So every time that there's a different definition of piety, like circle that and go, okay, this is a different part of the text. That helps you at least break down this into a couple different break points. Like, here's one part of the dialogue, here's a second part of the dialogue, here's a third part of the dialogue, etc. Then you can begin to sort of break up like sort of sub-arguments taking place in each one of those if you want. But for today, maybe consider that a good goal as you read it, okay? So to see these 1, 2, 3, or 4 parts of the dialogue. Okay, that's it for now. Take care all. God bless you. Bye-bye.